The Rothschild family did not build their financial empire because they had access to power. They built it precisely because every door to conventional power was locked, bolted, and guarded against them. Keep that inversion in mind. Everything that follows depends on it. Frankfurt, 1744. There is a street in this city, if you can call it a street, that runs approximately 330 meters from gate to gate. At its narrowest points, it is 4 meters wide. 4 meters. That is roughly the width of a single parking space in a modern car park. On either side of that gap, houses rise so tall and press so close together that sunlight does not reach the ground. Not in the morning, not at midday. The buildings lean toward each other at the upper floors as though exhausted by the effort of standing apart, and the space between them functions less like a street than like a shaft, a vertical slot punched through the city, sealed at the bottom by mud and bodies and the permanent smell of too many people in too little space. This was the Judengasse, the Jews' Lane, established by municipal decree in 1462, 300 years before anyone named Rothschild would do anything worth recording. Approximately 3,000 people lived inside it. 3,000 people in a space that, in any modern city, would constitute a single short block. The houses had been built taller and taller to absorb the overflow each generation, adding floors because they could not add ground until the structures lost whatever proportion buildings are supposed to have, and the street below them lost the sky. That is not a literary description. It is a measurable physical fact. The Judengasse was one of the densest inhabited environments in all of Europe, and the density was not accidental. It was produced and maintained by law. At each end of the street, a gate. Locked every night. Locked every Sunday. Locked on every Christian holiday the Frankfurt calendar recognized, which was a long list. The rhythm of the locking structured every life inside. You could not leave after dark. You could not leave on the Sabbath of the surrounding religion. The hours available to you in the open city were rationed by someone else's calendar, and the gate was the enforcement mechanism, not symbolic, physical, iron and wood, and the sound of a bolt sliding home. The legal framework governing all of this had a name, the Stetigkeit, a formal document specifying what the residents of the Judengasse could and could not do, each item arranged with the calm precision of administrative planning. If you travelled through Christian territory, left Frankfurt on business, crossed another city on your way somewhere, you paid the Leibzoll, the body tax, a tax on your physical existence in open space. Not on goods, not on transactions, on your body moving through land that was not designated for your kind of body. You could not own land outside the ghetto walls. You could not enter most trades and professions. And to prevent the population inside those walls from growing too large to manage, the Stetigkeit legally capped the number of Jewish marriages permitted per year. Population growth controlled by ordinance, the way a city might manage stray animals. Each of these provisions was a deliberate architectural decision, not prejudice expressed casually, a system thought through and written down with the specific purpose of containing a population inside a commercial and social structure from which it could not escape through ordinary means. Inside that structure, there was one crack, one domain the walls could not fully seal. The handling of other people's money, money lending, bill discounting, the movement of credit was a profession Christian guild law effectively denied to its own members in certain forms, which meant Jewish merchants could occupy it, not freely, not on equal terms, but they could occupy it, and over generations the families of the Judengasse did, because there was nowhere else to go. One family on that street lived in a house marked with a red shield painted on the exterior wall. Rothschild, in German. Red Shield. The name was not a choice. It was an identification marker, painted there before the family arrived, inherited along with the house and everything the house represented. The family would eventually take it as a surname, as Jewish families across the German states were required to do by municipal ordinance. The name that would appear on sovereign bond certificates across 5 countries in the next century. The name that would be invoked in parliaments, whispered in palaces, screamed by demagogues, and printed in the captions of cartoons depicting a spider crouching over a captured globe. That name was a painted shield on a house in a lane too narrow for direct sunlight. They did not choose it. It was assigned to them. That is the first lesson the story carries, and it arrives before a single protagonist has appeared. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world right now, whether that's midnight in London or a lazy afternoon somewhere in the American South, or early morning in Tokyo, drop your city and time zone in the comments. I read every one of them, and there is something genuinely strange about the fact that people on opposite ends of the planet are following the same story at the same moment. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next one goes up, and let me know what subject you'd like covered next. Now back to Frankfurt. What the Rothschilds would eventually build: the courier networks, the sovereign loans, the railway financing, the five-city financial architecture that would underwrite the British war against Napoleon and condition the options of European governments for half a century. Every piece of it was engineered from inside those 330 metres. The exclusion from land ownership, from most trades, from the professions, from movement after dark, all of it pressed whatever ambition existed in that street into the single available channel. The ghetto did not prevent what followed, it produced it. The walls were not an obstacle to be overcome. They were the forge. That is the thesis of this film, stated plainly and early, because everything else is evidence. Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born on the 23rd of February, 1744, inside those walls. He did not choose the Judengasse any more than his family chose the painted shield on the house. He arrived into it the way everyone arrived into it, without alternatives. He was approximately 12 years old when his parents died. Smallpox. Around 1755. The disease moved efficiently through the Judengasse, as disease tends to move through overcrowded spaces sealed against the outside world. His father went first, his mother shortly after. The specific age matters. 12 is not a child and not a man. It is the age at which you are old enough to understand exactly what has been lost, and not old enough to do much about it. He had no meaningful inheritance. The coin-dealing business his father had run was modest. What he had was the Judengasse, and the Judengasse was still locked at night. He was sent to Hanover. The Jewish community arranged it. This was how orphaned boys with aptitude were handled, routed toward institutions that could use them. The firm was Wolf Jakob Oppenheimer, a significant Jewish banking house operating in Hanover. Oppenheimer's firm was not a charity. They were training someone they expected to be useful, and what they taught was the operating system of 18th century European finance, double-entry bookkeeping, the discounting of bills of exchange, the mechanics of credit extended across distances between parties who would never meet face to face. This discipline existed because men like Mayer Amschel were excluded from most other commercial institutions. Guild law, professional restriction, the prohibitions of the Stetigkeit, all of it pushed Jewish commercial life into the handling of money and credit. The one domain Christian guilds could not straightforwardly claim for themselves. The apprenticeship at Oppenheimer's was not a privilege. It was the only available corridor. But inside that corridor, the education was real and it was precise, and Mayer Amschel absorbed it. He returned to Frankfurt by approximately 1763. He was 19. He had no patron, no title, no standing in any court, commercial or civil, and he was back inside the lane where sunlight did not reach the ground. What he had was a trained understanding of how money moved across borders. He started dealing in rare coins and antique medals. This requires some explanation, because it looks like a step sideways, a young man trained in banking deciding to sell collectibles instead. It was not sideways. It was the only available angle of approach. Rare coins were one of the few commodities that connected the Judengasse directly to aristocratic attention. Aristocrats collected, they had money, they had leisure, and they had the kind of vanity that required objects to reflect it back. A Holy Roman coin from the right century, a medal struck for the right emperor, was not just metal, it was a signal of learning and taste, and a man who could supply it with genuine knowledge of what he was selling could get an audience with people who would otherwise never acknowledge his existence. Mayer Amschel understood this immediately. The knowledge of numismatics he was building was not an end in itself. It was a social instrument. He was not selling coins. He was engineering access to men whose resources operated at a scale the Judengasse had never touched. The specific expertise was secondary to what it purchased, a reason for powerful people to open the door. He married Gutel Schnapper in 1770. 10 children followed 5 sons and 5 daughters. The sons are the ones whose names will appear later across 5 cities. But in 1770, none of that is visible. The network does not exist yet. What exists is a man in his late 20s, back in the Judengasse, with a growing family and a coin business and an education in how credit actually moves through the world. The domestic decision and the strategic decision are not 2 different decisions. The family he is building is also, though he cannot fully see it yet, the institution he is building. By approximately 1785, the business had shifted. Coin dealing had given way to banking and bill discounting, and the firm was moving money rather than moving medals. This transition was not accidental, and it was not sudden. It was the product of a method. Find the foothold available, develop the expertise required, and convert the relationship the foothold creates into something larger. Coins were the door. Banking was the room beyond it. The full arc runs from a 12-year-old orphan in a locked street to a functioning banker managing the finances of one of the most significant courts in Europe. And the arc is built not from inherited advantage, but from a series of deliberate conversions, each foothold turned into leverage for the next. By the 1790s, the firm, formerly named M.A. Rothschild and Söhne, was operating at scale. None of it arrived by accident. All of it was built from inside 330 meters of lane that the city of Frankfurt had decided was sufficient space for 3,000 people. That is the shape of the formation. A boy left alone inside a cage, trained in the one discipline the cage permitted, and then methodically, patiently converting that discipline into a system the cage was never designed to produce. The next question is how he got through the door. Wilhelm I, Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, was one of the wealthiest men in Europe. Not because of mines or manufacturing, not because of agriculture or trade, because he rented his subjects as soldiers to foreign powers. Hessian troops were a commodity, disciplined, trained, available, and priced accordingly. Britain hired them during the American Revolutionary War. Other governments hired them in other conflicts. The Landgrave collected the fees, reinvested the proceeds, and accumulated a fortune on a scale that most European monarchs, actual monarchs, with crowns and courts and the full apparatus of hereditary rule, could not match. By the time Mayer Amschel was circling the edges of his attention, Wilhelm IX was sitting on capital that could fund armies and pay the debts of sovereign states. That is the distance we are talking about. A coin dealer in a 4-meter-wide lane, dealing with a man whose financial power was measured in armies. Mayer Amschel knew exactly how wide that distance was. He also knew that men of Wilhelm's position had one consistent vulnerability. They wanted things a simple ledger could not supply. Taste, knowledge, objects that reflected learning back at the owner. Wilhelm collected rare coins, Holy Roman issues, medals struck for long-dead emperors, pieces that required expertise to identify and connections to locate. In Frankfurt, operating from inside the Judengasse, Mayer Amschel had spent years building exactly that expertise for exactly this kind of purpose. The approach he devised was simple and it was ruthless. He would offer Wilhelm coins below their market price, deliberately. Not as charity and not as an error in valuation. Mayer Amschel knew what the coins were worth better than almost anyone in Frankfurt. He was underpricing them on purpose, subsidizing the transaction out of his own margin, because what he was buying was not the coin's price, he was buying an audience. The logic is precise enough to be worth stating plainly. The cost of underpricing a rare coin by a few thalers is recoverable. You can make that margin back elsewhere. But an audience with a prince who controls sovereign-scale capital, who moves money at the level of entire armies that is not available at any normal price, it cannot be purchased directly. It can only be manufactured, through the steady accumulation of contact at terms the prince finds impossible to refuse. He was refused multiple times before he was received. This matters. A man willing to accept rejection repeatedly, while continuing to offer the same terms without complaint or desperation, is not making sales calls. He is applying pressure so subtle that the target cannot identify it as pressure. Each refusal required Mayor Amschel to simply try again, still offering something of value, still asking nothing objectionable in return. At some point, the accumulated effort made acceptance easier than continued refusal. Wilhelm received him, probably around 1769. The patience was not a personality trait. It was a method. And then, in 1769, something concrete arrived. A written warrant designating Mayor Amschel Rothschild as court factor Hoffactor to the court. The German term was Hofjude in common usage. Court Jew. The title had a long and complicated history in Central Europe, but its function in 1769 was specific. It was a letter from a reigning prince that said, in formal language, that this man operates under my patronage. Mayor Amschel had it printed on his business stationery immediately. That detail is worth sitting with. Not framed and mounted on a wall, not kept in a drawer for emergencies. Printed on the stationery he used for commercial correspondence so that every letter he sent, every bill of exchange, every business proposition arrived already wrapped in the credential. In a world where a Jewish merchant had no standing in most commercial courts, where the Städtikites stripped him of professional legitimacy almost everywhere outside the Judengasse, a letter of patronage from a landgrave was not a social nicety. It was armour. It did not grant equality. It granted a workaround, a mechanism for operating in spaces that would otherwise be legally closed. Now the credential must be distinguished from the relationship it made possible, because they are not the same thing, and conflating them distorts the timeline of what actually happened. The 1769 warrant was the door. The full banking relationship with Wilhelm IX, the management of his investment portfolios, the deployment of the vast sums generated by renting Hessian soldiers to foreign powers developed more substantially across the 1780s and 1790s. The coin dealing unlocked the relationship unlocked the banking unlocked everything else. Each stage was a deliberate conversion of one kind of access into a deeper kind. This is the sequence that matters. Coins to audiences, audiences to credentials, credentials to banking relationships to sovereign-scale capital operations. No single step in that chain looks, from the outside, like the founding of a dynasty. Each step looks like a modest commercial transaction between a Frankfurt dealer and a wealthy collector. The transformation happens in the accumulation of steps, not in any individual moment. By the 1790s, M.A. Rothschild & Cerner was operating at scale. The firm's letterhead bore the court factor designation. The business that had begun with rare medals and deliberate losses on individual transactions was now managing capital at a level that placed it among the significant private banking operations in the German states. Wilhelm's fortune, generated by decades of soldier leasing and carefully managed investment, was one of its anchors. Mayor Amschel died in 1812. He never left the Judengasse as a legal matter. He lived inside those 330 meters his entire life, subject to the same curfews and body taxes and restrictions that had governed his father's life before him. What changed was what he built inside those conditions. He identified the one thing a prince with a coin collection wanted, that a Jewish merchant from Frankfurt could supply. He priced it strategically. He absorbed the losses. He waited out the refusals. And he converted a letter on his stationery into an architecture of sovereign-scale finance. The coin dealing was, by the end, irrelevant except as the lesson in how the whole system started. Find what powerful men want and be the person who provides it at a price they cannot refuse. The Judengasse gate was still locked every night, and from inside it, Mayer Amschel had just built the door to everything. By the time Mayer Amschel Rothschild died on 19 September 1812, aged 68, he had 5 sons stationed across Europe. Amschel Mayer remained in Frankfurt. Salomon Mayer was operating in Vienna. Nathan Mayer had been in England for over a decade. Karl Mayer was moving toward Naples. Jacob, who would become James, was establishing himself in Paris. Together they covered the continent's 5 most consequential financial capitals. That is not a coincidence. It is a blueprint. The cities are worth naming precisely because their selection was not sentimental. Frankfurt was the German banking centre and the family's operational base. Vienna was the capital of the Habsburg Empire, the dominant continental power. London sat at the centre of the world's largest trading economy and its most sophisticated capital markets. Paris was the engine of French state finance, under whatever government happened to be running France that particular year, and in the early 19th century, governments in France changed with startling frequency. Naples controlled the financial gateway to the Mediterranean south. Place those 5 cities on a map, and you have covered the financial geography of a continent. Move money through any one of them, and it can reach the others within days, via a single trusted family intermediary. No commercial bank of that era could replicate that coverage. No government could either. He died in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. The timing is precise and it matters. By September 1812, Napoleon had already pushed into Russia a campaign that would break him. Wellington was advancing in Spain. The entire European order was in violent flux, and sovereign governments on both sides of the conflict were desperate for credit. The network Mayer Amschel had built was, at the exact moment of his death, positioned to become indispensable to the men deciding the outcome of the century. He saw its initial shape. He did not live to see what it became. The next chapter of the network's history would be written by his sons, without him, at the highest possible stakes. The document he left behind was not a will in any ordinary sense. It was a corporate charter. Amos Elon, in his portrait of Mayer Amschel, states it with precision. He was not leaving money to his sons. He was leaving them a system. The provisions make this clear. Women of the family were explicitly excluded from the banking business, not as an afterthought and not from sentiment, but as a calculated structural decision. Marriages brought outside interests into a firm. Outside interests diluted partnerships. Diluted partnerships fractured capital. By excluding daughters from inheriting shares in the banking operation, Mayer Amschel prevented the business from being slowly disaggregated by the ordinary mechanics of family life. The 5 brothers were instructed to keep capital unified, to consult one another on major decisions, and to operate as a single organism across 5 separate locations. In a period before telegraphs, before railways, before any mechanism for instantaneous long-distance communication, that instruction was only meaningful if it was already embedded in the architecture, which it was. What that architecture created was a private courier network, capable of delivering financial intelligence faster than any state's official dispatch system. This is the competitive advantage that would define the next 3 decades. Information about crop failures in France, troop movements in the Low Countries, debt negotiations in Vienna. It moved through the Rothschild family correspondence before it moved through any foreign ministry. The advantage was structural, built into the network topology rather than into any individual's exceptional knowledge. Take Nathan out of London and replace him with another competent banker, and the information flow through London continues, because the channel is the city and the family connection, not the man. That is what a system looks like, as opposed to a business built on a single person's relationships. There is an honest complication to the tidiest version of this story, and it should be stated plainly. The framing of a single master plan, 5 sons dispatched to 5 cities in one decisive act of strategic genius, is partly retrospective. Nathan did not move to England as the designated London node of a continental financial network. He moved to Manchester around 1798 or 1799, aged roughly 21, initially to purchase textiles. He was following a commercial signal, not executing a blueprint. The London operation came later. The network formalized over time rather than crystallizing from a single founding moment. It was partly designed and partly emergent, and the honest version of that story, the one where a system assembles itself across years and cities and contingent decisions made by individuals who could not fully see what they were building, is more interesting than the legend of a patriarch dispatching sons like chess pieces across a board. The human cost of the network's success is most legible in a single documented fact. Nathan did not return to Frankfurt in time to see his father before he died. He was in London. The business was in London. The distance between them, physical, commercial, structural, was by 1,812 real distance, not symbolic distance. The system Mayer Amschel had built required his sons to be somewhere else. That requirement did not pause for illness or death. The dispersal that was the network's strength was also the mechanism by which a dying man spent his final weeks separated from at least one of his sons. The system's success and the family's dispersal are the same thing. They cannot be separated because they were produced by the same decisions. What Mayer Amschel left behind then was not a fortune in the conventional sense. It was a set of relationships, family, sovereign, financial, structured by a will that read more like a founding constitution than a personal document, embedded in a geography of 5 cities chosen for their centrality to European power, and animated by a courier network faster than any state's. The coin dealing was ancient history. The court factor warrant was a relic. What remained, and what would operate for the next half-century at the centre of European sovereign finance, was the architecture itself. Nathan was already in London, building it forward without ever having said goodbye. Manchester, 1799. Nathan Mayer Rothschild is 21 years old. He speaks almost no English. He has come from Frankfurt, from the Judengasse, from everything that implies to purchase textiles for the family business, because English cloth was cheaper at source than through the Frankfurt middlemen, and the margin between those two prices was real money. That was the calculation. Nothing grander. He was not arriving as the designated London node of a continental financial empire. He was following a price signal. He stayed. The reason he stayed is precisely the reason he would spend the rest of his life operating the way he did. Manchester in the late 1790s was the engine room of the first industrial economy mills running around the clock, merchants moving cloth at volumes that dwarfed anything Frankfurt's trading houses had prepared him for. The opportunity was not in executing the original errand and returning home. The opportunity was in staying, watching how the market actually worked, and then positioning himself inside it rather than at its edge. Nathan recognized this, without needing it explained to him. That capacity for rapid environmental reading, identifying where value was being created and moving directly toward it was the skill. The textiles were just the occasion for discovering he had it. Within his first few years in Manchester, he had done something that most merchants spent careers trying to accomplish. He cut out the middlemen. Not gradually, not through social connection or inherited relationships, through practice. He taught himself currency exchange and bill discounting by doing it, transaction by transaction, until he understood the mechanics well enough to operate directly on his own account. Currency markets were not mysterious. They were just information problems. You needed to know where exchange rates were mispriced relative to each other and move faster than the next person. Bills of discounting were credit instruments, a promise of future payment purchased at a discount for immediate cash. Both disciplines rewarded exactly the things Nathan was constitutionally suited for: speed, precision, and an absolute indifference to what other people thought of his methods. This is the element of the founding story that gets buried under the myth of the patriarch in his blueprint. The network did not work because Mayor Amschel sent 5 exceptional sons to 5 cities. It worked because each son, operating alone in a foreign commercial environment, rebuilt the family's capabilities from scratch using whatever local conditions presented. Nathan arrived in England without language, without established relationships, without any infrastructure beyond his own judgment. What he built in Manchester, and then in London, he built by learning it in practice. That is not a detail about Nathan's biography, it is the proof of concept for the entire network. The system Mayor Amschel designed could only function if the individuals running each node were capable of doing exactly this. Nathan, in Manchester, demonstrated that at least one of them was. He moved to London around 1804. The logic was the same as staying in Manchester had been. The opportunity had shifted, and he followed it. He established N.M., Rothschild and Sons on St. Swithin's Lane in the City of London. The firm still operates at that address today. That continuity is not sentiment, it is evidence. What Nathan planted on St. Swithin's Lane in 1804 was structurally durable enough to survive the Napoleonic Wars, the revolutions of 1830 and 1848, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the Holocaust. Most institutions do not survive one of those events. The address is the record of what was built. What was built, and how Nathan operated inside it, is most legibly rendered in a single recurring scene. The Royal Exchange in London was the social and commercial centre of British financial life, a colonnaded hall where merchants, bankers and brokers gathered to trade information as much as instruments. It had a culture. There were codes for how a man conducted himself on the floor, how he signalled confidence, how he cultivated relationships with the right counterparties. Nathan operated in that environment as though the culture did not apply to him, because he had decided it didn't. He was physically imposing, large, blunt, and almost aggressively direct in manner. A Danish diplomat named Nathaniel Wraxall, who observed Nathan on the exchange floor, described him as coarse and unpolished. Nathan, by all accounts, did not dispute this assessment. He found the assessment irrelevant. He was not at the Royal Exchange to be liked or admired or integrated into the social fabric of English commercial life. He was there to be indispensable, which is a different project entirely and one he was considerably better at. He had a specific pillar. On the floor of the Royal Exchange, Nathan stood with his back against a particular column so consistently across so many years that other traders named it after him. The Rothschild pillar. He would stand there and watch, not speak, not circulate, not perform the minor social rituals by which other men signalled their activity and importance. Watch. Other traders found the stillness unnerving, more unnerving, observers noted, than any display of aggression or urgency would have been. The pillar is a small detail with a precise implication. The most formidable private financier on the floor of the Royal Exchange expressed his dominance through the refusal to move. Nathan left one statement on record that holds up as a direct quotation documented in family correspondence and cited by Ferguson. It is the only well-sourced sentence he can be confirmed to have said, and it is enough. It requires a great deal of boldness and a great deal of caution to make a great fortune, and when you have got it, it requires 10 times as much wit to keep it. No flourish, no claim about destiny or divine favour, or the superiority of his methods. The sentence is a structural observation about the mechanics of risk, delivered by a man who had been running those mechanics in practice since his first months in Manchester. Boldness and caution in the right proportions to build it. 10 times the intelligence to hold what you have built. The viewer has spent 4 sections watching exactly that philosophy execute itself in coin dealing calibrated to purchase access rather than profit, in a will structured as a corporate charter, in a 21-year-old cutting out middlemen in a language he was still learning. The sentence closes that sequence. What Nathan built on St. Swithin's Lane was now the western anchor of a 5-city network spanning the continent. And the continent, in 1804, was at war. £831 million. That is what Britain spent on the wars between 1793 and 1815. Not on a single campaign, not on a single year. Across 22 years of almost continuous conflict from the first revolutionary armies crossing the Rhine to Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo, the British state consumed roughly £831 million financing its own military operations and subsidising Allied powers across the continent. Place that against something the viewer can actually hold. The entire annual budget of the British government at the start of that period was somewhere around £20 million. The wars cost 40 times that annual budget, compounded across 2 decades. No personal relationship between a banker and a minister could move money at that scale. No gentleman's handshake across a dining table could guarantee that a subsidy paid in London would arrive intact in Lisbon or Vienna or St. Petersburg. Governments at that scale of expenditure do not need friendships. They need mechanisms. The mechanism the Rothschilds provided was specific. British subsidies to Allied governments' payments designed to keep Prussia, Austria, and smaller German states in the field against Napoleon had to move across a continent that Napoleon's armies were actively contesting. The political allegiance of every customs official, every regional governor, every border checkpoint between London and the intended recipient was uncertain. Gold coin, the most reliable form of payment, was also the most easily seized. Bills of exchange paper instruments promising future payment were only as good as the creditworthiness of the house that issued them, and in wartime that creditworthiness could evaporate overnight if the issuing firm's home city changed hands. What the Rothschilds had was the one thing no single government possessed: a family trust structure spanning 5 cities, each node run by a brother whose loyalty was to the network rather than to any particular sovereign, operating through private couriers rather than state postal systems, in a correspondence encoded against interception. Money could enter the network in London as a bill of exchange drawn on Nathan, travel to Frankfurt as a set of instructions in cipher, and emerge in Vienna or Naples as credit available to the recipient government, without ever crossing a checkpoint in a form that could be confiscated. The infrastructure was the product of necessity. It had been built to operate across hostile environments because the Judengasse had taught the family that all environments were hostile. Now Britain needed exactly that infrastructure and was willing to pay for it. Nathan became the primary agent for British subsidy transfers to Allied powers. The business model was straightforward in principle and dangerous in practice. Arrange the financing, guarantee the transfer, take a fee, absorb the risk that the mechanism failed. In 1814, Nathan organised one of the most operationally complex transactions the network had yet attempted. He purchased £1.2 million in gold coin from the East India Company, a firm with reserves large enough to supply that quantity in physical metal, and arranged its movement across war-torn Europe to Wellington's forces in the peninsula and to Allied governments on the continent. This was not a wire transfer. It was gold. It had weight, volume, and visibility. Moving it required coordinating the Rothschild courier network across multiple sovereign jurisdictions simultaneously, managing the political relationships in each city to ensure passage, and trusting that every link in the chain held under conditions where a single failure meant the metal vanished. The operation succeeded. Ferguson treats it as one of Nathan's landmark achievements, and the reason is not hard to see. The abstract claim that the network could move sovereign capital at continental scale had been tested and confirmed under the worst possible conditions. Now the moral hinge. While Nathan was building the London operation and the subsidy mechanism, back in Frankfurt, something else was happening, something the traditional account of Rothschild trustworthiness rests on, and something Amos Elon spent considerable time examining with rather less comfort than the traditional account allows. Napoleon occupied Hesse-Kassel in 1806. Wilhelm I, the same Landgrave whose rare coin collection had given Mayor Amschel his first aristocratic audience 3 decades earlier, whose soldier leasing revenues had funded the early banking operation, was forced to flee. His assets remained. French confiscation was the obvious threat. Mayer Amschel, now deep in the final years of his life, continued managing Wilhelm's holdings and actively concealing them from French authorities. When Napoleon fell and the political order reconstituted itself, those funds were returned. Wilhelm got his money back. The traditional interpretation of this episode is that it established the Rothschilds as the most trustworthy private bankers in Europe, that when a prince's fortune was at risk, the family that held it could be relied upon absolutely. That reputation, earned in the crisis years between 1806 and 1814, opened doors with European royalty that no amount of coin dealing or bill discounting could have unlocked. Amos Elon asks a harder question. The concealment period coincided exactly with the years when the Rothschild network was expanding most rapidly, when Nathan was establishing himself in London, when the family was moving from regional banking to continental operations, when they needed capital to fund positions at a scale their own resources could not fully support. Elon raises the possibility that the Rothschilds deployed Wilhelm's hidden capital to generate profit for themselves during those years, effectively using a client's money as the base for their own expansion at the moment when that expansion was most critical. Whether the returns eventually credited back to Wilhelm were fully and accurately accounted for, whether every franc of profit generated by deploying his capital came back to him, or whether some portion of it became the foundation of something else, the archival record from this period is not complete enough to determine. This is not a verdict. It is a genuinely open question, and the film presents it as one because that is what the evidence warrants. The two readings can coexist: an act of genuine loyalty to a client under political threat, and a period during which a client's resources were used in ways the client may not have fully understood or consented to. Historical reality rarely presents itself in a form that makes clean moral conclusions possible. What can be said with confidence is that the Hesse-Kassel episode is the hinge of the founding story if the relationship was straightforwardly honourable. The Rothschild ascent is a story of competence and trust rewarded. If it involved the exploitation of concealment, the foundation of the fortune contains a question that no subsequent success resolves. What the Napoleonic Wars confirmed, whatever the moral texture of any individual episode within them, was structural. For roughly a decade, from the mid-1800s through 1815, the movement of sovereign capital at continental scale flowed through a single private network. Britain needed to pay its allies. Its allies needed to receive those payments in usable form. No state apparatus could manage the logistics. The Rothschilds could. That is indispensability, not as a metaphor, but as a measurable operational fact. And indispensability, at that scale, is its own form of power. The Napoleonic Wars ended. The power did not. 18 June 1815. Nathan Rothschild is in London. He is 37 years old, running the most important private banking operation in Europe from a building on St. Swithin's Lane, standing each morning with his back against a pillar on the Royal Exchange floor while other traders watch him and wait. 200 miles away, across the Channel, on a field outside a Belgian village called Waterloo, the outcome of European power is being settled by artillery and infantry, and the specific question of whether the Prussian army under Blücher arrives in time to support Wellington's left flank. If Napoleon wins, the map redraws. The bond markets of every European sovereign shift. Every position Nathan holds, every credit relationship the network has built across 5 cities over the past decade, recalibrates against a different political reality. The next 48 hours are not about one man's profits. They are about which version of Europe wakes up on June 20th. Here is what the documents show. A British agent named John Roworth reached the Rothschild courier network in the Netherlands on June 19th with confirmation of Napoleon's defeat. The information travelled through the network's established channel private courier, not state dispatch, and reached Nathan in London on approximately June 19th or 20th. The official British government news, carried by Major Henry Percy, arrived in London the evening of June 20th. Nathan had the outcome of Waterloo roughly 1 full day before the government whose bonds he traded knew it themselves. The courier system had performed exactly as designed, faster than any state apparatus, across borders that state messengers still required time and authorization to cross. 1 day. That was the margin. Now here is what most people know about what Nathan did with it, and almost all of it is wrong. The story, as it travelled across Europe and eventually around the world, goes like this. Nathan went to the Royal Exchange on the morning after he received his intelligence. He positioned himself at his pillar, the Rothschild pillar, the one other traders already watched, and then, instead of buying, he began to sell, quietly at first, then more. British government bonds consoles began to leave his hands in volume. Other traders on the floor noticed. They drew the obvious conclusion. Rothschild is selling. Nathan Rothschild, who knows things before other men know them, is selling British bonds. The battle must have gone badly. Napoleon must have won. The panic spread outward from that pillar like a wave. Console prices collapsed. Other traders sold. Prices fell further. And then at the bottom, when everyone else had abandoned the market, Nathan's agents moved through the exchange, buying everything back at ruined prices, accumulating a position in British government debt that, when Wellington's victory became public the following evening, generated a profit of enormous scale in a single day. 1 theatrical performance, 1 manufactured panic, millions made. That is the legend. Name it clearly, because it needs to be seen whole before it comes apart. The pamphlet that introduced this version to the world was published in 1846, more than a decade after Nathan's death in 1836. It appeared in French propagandistic form, sometimes identified as Napoléon et la trahison des banquiers. The embellishments were not random invention. They were attached to a real event, the confirmed advance intelligence, and they spread precisely because the underlying fact was true. A myth built on a distorted truth is harder to kill than one built on nothing. The public knew Nathan had the information early. The public knew he profited. The specific mechanism of the short sell and panic was an elaboration, a story that made emotional sense of facts that were genuinely unusual. By the time that version began circulating in pamphlet form and press reprints, Nathan was dead and unable to produce a counter-account. His family's subsequent silence on the matter opacity was the family's operating mode, for reasons the viewer already understands, only made the story more plausible to those inclined to believe it. The legend did not stop there. Nearly a century later, in 1940, the Nazi regime produced a propaganda film titled Die Rothschilds. The Waterloo manipulation sequence is at its centre, rendered with all the production values the German film industry could supply. State-sponsored cinema, distributed across occupied Europe, using a distorted account of a real banking family's most celebrated episode as the vehicle for a specific political message about Jewish financial predation. The film is not tangential to what happened to the Vienna branch in the years immediately following its release. It is preparation for it. The myth had a purpose beyond entertainment, and the purpose was not benign. Now, what Niall Ferguson actually found when he examined the Rothschild trading records: no dramatic short and cover maneuver, no engineered panic. What the records show, to the extent they show anything with clarity, is that Nathan's position in the days around Waterloo was long, not short. He was buying British consoles, not selling them. His reasoning was straightforward. He expected the bonds to rise when Wellington's victory became public, and he bought accordingly. He was correct. He made a significant profit. But it was the profit of a man with better information than everyone else in the market, who acted on that information competently and correctly, not the profit of a theatrical manipulator who orchestrated a mass panic and then exploited it. The distinction matters. It matters because the myth describes something qualitatively different from what the records suggest: a predatory short sell requiring deliberate deception of other market participants. versus an informed long position of the kind that any trader with early intelligence might take. And here is where intellectual honesty requires stopping and saying something uncomfortable. The archival record of Nathan's specific trading positions in June 1815 is incomplete. The precise mechanism, what he held, what he sold, what he bought, and in what sequence over those specific days cannot be fully reconstructed from the surviving documents. Ferguson's conclusion that the short sell legend is unsupported by the records is the strongest statement the evidence allows. It is not a complete exoneration. The gap in the documentation cannot be filled in either direction. The question that remains open is precise. Was the Waterloo episode, the founding moment of what we would now call insider trading, a real event, the family subsequently obscured, or was it a myth invented by enemies that the family was powerless to disprove because the underlying truth, advance information, was real even if the specific details were false? The honest answer is that we do not fully know, and the film will not pretend otherwise. What can be said is that the myth's staying power was guaranteed the moment the first pamphlet connected it to a fact no one disputed. Nathan did have the news early. The courier network was real. Everything else that attached itself to that fact, the theatrical selling, the manufactured panic, the millions from a single maneuver travelled in the slipstream of something true, which is exactly what made it so durable and so dangerous. 3 years after Waterloo, the family made a transaction that had nothing to do with a battle or a courier or a dramatic morning on the exchange floor. It was quieter than that, and it was more consequential. In 1818, the Rothschilds issued a £5 million loan on behalf of the Prussian government. Stop there for a moment, because the mechanism is the point. Prussia needed capital. It could not raise that capital from domestic sources fast enough to serve its needs. So it issued bonds, debt instruments promising repayment of principal plus interest, underwritten against future tax revenue. The Rothschilds did not simply lend Prussia money from their own reserves. They underwrote the bond issue, priced it, and then distributed it to investors across multiple sovereign jurisdictions simultaneously. Buyers in London, buyers in Paris. Buyers in Vienna, Frankfurt and Naples, one for each of the 5 brothers, each working their own network of investors, each operating inside a different legal and financial system. Prussia received its capital immediately. Investors across 5 countries received a reliable income stream. The Rothschilds received a fee, and something more durable than a fee. They became the infrastructure through which a sovereign government had just accessed the savings of an entire continent. That was the architecture. Not a single loan between 2 parties. A distribution network spanning 5 capitals, capable of matching sovereign borrowers with investor capital at a scale no single city bank could reach. This is what the family had been building since Mayor Amschel's will. The 1,818 Prussian loan was the proof of concept at full scale. By 1821, Karl Mayer had established the Naples operation and was handling loans to the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. The 5th city was now fully functional. What that meant in practical terms: a bond issued in one country could be held by investors in 4 others, with a Rothschild brother in each city managing the local relationship, the local legal requirements, and the local investor expectations. No competitor had that. The Barings brothers in London were formidable. Other Frankfurt banking houses were experienced. But none of them had a family member in Naples answering letters from a family member in Vienna about positions that Nathan in London had already priced. The network's competitive advantage was not any individual's brilliance. It was the structure itself. James confirmed this in 1823. By that point, he was no longer Nathan's representative in Paris. He was an independent financial power, advising the French Restoration government directly. That year, he arranged loans worth approximately 270 million francs to the French state, roughly the annual revenue of a mid-sized European kingdom. James was 27 years old. He had arrived in Paris 12 years earlier as a teenager, carrying his brother's instructions. The distance covered in those 12 years is not incidental. It tells you that the network replicated itself in each city, not through imposition from the center, but through the individual capacity of each brother to convert proximity into indispensability on his own terms. By the late 1820s, the Rothschilds were the largest banking house in the world. That is Ferguson's assessment, and it is consistent with the historical record. Not the largest bank in London, not the largest in Germany, the largest private banking house on earth, at a time when European finance was the financial system that mattered globally. Their dominance over European sovereign debt issuance was near total, from approximately 1,820 through 1,860. Nearly every major government bond issue on the continent passed through Rothschild hands during that 4-decade window. Then, in 1835, the family did something that reframes the entire picture. They obtained the concession to operate the mercury mines at Almaden in Spain. Not a loan, not a bond issue. A real asset, one of the largest mercury deposits in the world, which produced the mercury used in silver refining across the Spanish-American colonial system. The Rothschilds were not collecting a fee for arranging someone else's transaction. They were extracting a commodity from the ground and selling it into a global supply chain. The Almaden concession came to them through a sovereign debt arrangement. Spain needed financing, and the mines were part of what Spain offered in return, which means the mechanism of the bond market had become a tool for acquiring physical resources, not just earning intermediary fees. That is a different kind of power than underwriting. That is the power to hold something the world needs. The question that follows from all of this is one the film has been working towards since the Napoleonic Wars. What did financial power at this scale actually mean for the governments that depended on it? The honest answer is more precise and less dramatic than the mythology suggests. Nathan's threat to withhold credit was a genuine instrument of leverage that governments took seriously. When a sovereign borrower needed to refinance debt or raise new capital and the primary distributor of that debt signaled reluctance, the cost of the transaction rose or the transaction could not happen at the required terms at all. That is real pressure. It was felt in chancelleries. Officials adjusted their behavior in anticipation of it. In that specific, concrete sense, the Rothschilds conditioned the available options of European governments in ways that no elected body or legal instrument formally authorized. But Ferguson's caution here is also grounded in the evidence. Conditioning options is not the same as determining decisions. The Rothschilds could express a preference to Metternich or to the French finance ministry. Sometimes the preference was accommodated, sometimes it was not. The revolutions of 1830 and 1848 happened despite James de Rothschild's comprehensive entanglement with the French and Austrian states. The Crimean War was financed by governments that the Rothschilds had relationships with on both sides. The direction of causality did not run reliably from banker to sovereign. Governments used the Rothschilds as much as the Rothschilds used governments, and the dependency was mutual in ways that limited how far any single instrument of financial pressure could be pushed before the relationship itself became the casualty. What the Rothschilds could not do, for all their structural position, was guarantee the political stability that made their business possible. They were dependent on a European order they had financed but could not control. The architecture they had built was real, and its reach was continental, and its persistence across 4 decades of sovereign lending was something no private institution had achieved before. But it operated inside political conditions it could shape only at the margins. That is the uncomfortable clarity the transactions of this period produce. A private family, operating from 5 cities, had become the layer underneath European state finance, not through seizure or conquest, but through being the only available mechanism for something every government needed. The power was structural. The limits were structural too. August 1836. Nathan Rothschild is 58 years old, at the absolute peak of his power, and he is dying in Frankfurt of a septic abscess. He had not travelled there for any financial reason. He had come for a wedding. His son Lionel was marrying his niece Charlotte. Charlotte being the daughter of Nathan's brother Carl in Naples, a cousin marriage. The family practiced this deliberately and consistently across multiple generations because Mayor Amschel's will had been explicit about the threat. Outside marriages brought outside interests, and outside interests diluted the partnership. The solution was structural. Keep the capital inside the family by keeping the family inside itself. Lionel and Charlotte's wedding was not a romantic arrangement dressed up in corporate logic. It was Mayor Amschel's corporate charter, still operating 24 years after his death, enforcing itself in the next generation's wedding vows. Nathan understood this completely. He had built his life inside the same logic. The man who stood unmoved at the Rothschild pillar on the Royal Exchange floor, who had taught himself currency exchange in Manchester without English, and had moved sovereign gold across a war-torn continent. This man had also married his daughters into branches of the network, arranged his sons' matches with the same deliberate attention he gave bond pricing, and complied with every instruction of a will he had been too far away to witness being signed. The system ran through him. In August 1836, it was still running through him. From his sickbed, Nathan issued instructions about ongoing transactions, not letters of farewell, not arrangements for his estate. Business instructions, positions that needed managing, deals that needed direction, correspondence that needed answers. The people who recorded this described a man who appeared to recognize that the system required his attention until the moment it could no longer have it, and who gave that attention with the same blunt efficiency he had applied to everything else. The sepsis was advancing. He kept working. He died before the end of the month. The news travelled by the fastest available means, which, in the Rothschild network, was still faster than most, and when it arrived in London, Paris and Vienna, it moved markets. Contemporary accounts in the Times and other London papers noted this explicitly. Not in terms of grief, in terms of prices. Sovereign debt moved. Bond yields shifted. The death of a private citizen in Frankfurt, a man who held no government post, commanded no army, and appeared on no official list of anyone who actually ran anything, had registered across the sovereign debt markets of 3 countries simultaneously. The papers noted this as a fact about the markets. It was also a fact about what Nathan had been. He was buried in the Jewish cemetery in Frankfurt. The epitaph his family chose described him simply as a banker. One word. Not financier to kings, not architect of sovereign debt, not any of the titles that the preceding 30 years of the man's career had, by any reasonable accounting, earned. A banker. The restraint is not modesty, and it is not accident. It is a statement so compressed it takes a moment to unfold. The family that had watched Nathan move £1 million in gold across a continent at war, that had seen his name in the Times alongside reports of shifting bond prices on the day of his death, chose to reduce everything to one word. They were not understating what he was. They were defining it. A banker. That is what this was. That is what this family did. The word carries everything the viewer has been watching for the last 8 chapters, and it asks nothing in return. The question that follows is the real test of the entire story. What happens to a system built on indispensability when the indispensable man is gone? The answer arrived almost immediately, and it was the answer Mayor Amschel had spent his last years engineering. N.M. Rothschild and Sons on St. Swithin's Lane did not close. It did not falter. The sovereign lending relationships with the British government, with the Austrian Habsburgs, with the French state, with the Prussian crown continued without interruption. The 4 brothers still operating across Frankfurt, Vienna, Paris and Naples received the news and kept working. The courier network kept moving. The bond operations kept pricing. The system that Nathan had been the most powerful single node of simply routed around the absence and proceeded. This was not resilience in the ordinary sense of a business surviving a setback. It was the proof of a specific architectural claim, the claim embedded in Mayor Amschel's will, in the instruction to keep capital unified and brothers consulting each other, in the deliberate dispersal to 5 cities, rather than the consolidation of everything in the most capable pair of hands. The will had anticipated exactly this moment. Not Nathan's death specifically, but the death of any single node. The system was designed to be indifferent to the loss of its most important individual because the point of the system was that no individual was the point. That is a cold thing to have understood about a family business. It is also the reason the firm still exists. Nathan was the most capable of the 5 sons. By most accounts, the most operationally aggressive, the most financially innovative, the one who had built something in London from nothing in a foreign language in a few years. His death at 58, at the moment of maximum institutional power, before the telegraph had erased the information advantage and before joint stock banks had changed the competitive landscape, was the kind of loss that should have been catastrophic. It was not catastrophic, because Mayor Amschel had built something that did not depend on any single person's survival. He had converted a family into an institution. The institution did not grieve in ways that markets could see. The Rothschild pillar on the Royal Exchange stood empty after August 1836. Other traders passed it. Some of them noted the absence. The firm on St. Swithin's Lane opened the next morning. James de Rothschild arrived in Paris around 1811. He was 19 years old. He spoke French with a German accent and carried letters of credit from his brother in London. His official role was Nathan's representative, a junior agent managing correspondence, facilitating transfers, keeping the Paris end of the network operational while the real decisions were made elsewhere. That was the arrangement. It did not last long. By the 1830s, James was the most powerful private financier in France, not by appointment, not by inheritance, by accumulation of relationships, of sovereign debt positions, of the one thing that French governments across wildly different political dispensations consistently needed and could not reliably produce on their own. Credit at scale, delivered quickly, on terms that actually held. What makes this worth examining carefully is the sequence of regimes James outlasted. He arrived during Napoleon's First Empire. He then advised the Bourbon Restoration, then the July Monarchy under Louis Philippe, then the Second Republic, then Napoleon III's Second Empire. 5 distinct political orders, each with its own theory of legitimate authority, each with its own aristocracy, its own enemies, its own officials who either trusted or despised private banking, and through every transition, James remained. The governments changed, the banker persisted. This is not a coincidence of longevity. It is a structural fact about what James had made himself. The indispensable intermediary between the French state's appetite for capital and the investors across Europe willing to supply it, a function that survived revolutions because revolutions, once they settled into governance, still needed to borrow money. In 1846, that function produced its most visible physical result. James financed the Chemin de Fer du Nord, the first major French railway line, connecting Paris to the channel ports at Calais and Boulogne. When it opened, it did not merely move passengers faster. It reorganized the economic geography of northern France, linked French manufacturing to British markets, and made the movement of goods between Paris and the Channel a matter of hours rather than days. James was not lending money to a government for an abstract purpose. He was building something you could see and stand on and ride. Sovereign-scale private capital, directed at infrastructure rather than war, producing a result that outlasted any bond coupon or interest payment. The railway is there today. It still runs. The Chemin de Fer du Nord became the backbone of what is now the Northern French rail network. James's name does not appear on the timetables, but the route does. Then there is Ferrières. Completed in 1859, the chateau at Ferrières-en-Brie was one of the largest private estates in France, a country not short of large private estates. Designed by Joseph Paxton, who had built the Crystal Palace in London, Ferrières was built to a scale that made its intent unmistakable. This was not a country retreat, it was a statement. The grounds covered roughly 1,000 acres. The building itself contained dozens of rooms furnished at a level that made most royal residences look provisional. Napoleon III visited for a hunting weekend. Standing on the grounds, the Emperor of France surveyed what a private banker from the Frankfurt Judengasse had built, and reportedly remarked that kings could not have afforded it. Only a Rothschild could. The exact wording varies across accounts. Ferguson flags this as an anecdote that circulated widely enough to be recorded in multiple places without a single definitive source. But the persistence of the story across different accounts tells you something. Whether Napoleon III said those precise words is genuinely uncertain. That contemporaries believed he might have, and that it captured exactly how James was perceived, is not uncertain at all. Sometimes, the anecdote that cannot be fully verified is the clearest evidence of how a person occupied the imagination of everyone around him. James occupied that imagination by design. He understood that in France, financial power was performed as well as exercised. The chateau was part of the performance. The dinner invitations to the right ministers, the hunting weekends, the social calendar managed with the same precision as a bond issuance, all of it was operational. He was not indulging himself. He was building the kind of access that could not be purchased directly, only cultivated over time at considerable expense and with considerable discipline. And then, beneath all of it, the private letters. Ferguson examined James's personal correspondence in the Rothschild archive, and what he found there is a small piece of evidence that reframes everything above it. James's letters written to family, to brothers, in the unguarded register of private communication, are not in French. They are not in German. They are in all three at once, French, German, and Yiddish, mixed sentence by sentence, sometimes word by word, in the way that a man writes when he is not performing for anyone. James employed secretaries specifically to clean up his written French before official correspondence went out. The formal letters read correctly. The private ones do not bother. Ferguson's observation lands with precision. This is how recently these men had come from the Judengasse. The man advising French kings and building chateaux on a scale that humbled emperors still thought in the language of a sealed ghetto street in Frankfurt. The social ascent and the origin were not two separate stories. They were the same story running simultaneously, never fully resolved. James de Rothschild did not leave the Judengasse behind. He carried it with him into every salon and every sovereign negotiation, invisible to everyone except the people who read his private mail. This matters for the question the film has been circling since Nathan's death. What did James's power actually consist of? He could express preferences to French governments. Sometimes they listened. The Chemin de Fer du Nord happened in part because James wanted it, and pushed for it and financed it on terms that made it possible. That is real. But the revolutions of 1830 and 1848 also happened, and James did not prevent them. He had no mechanism for preventing them. Political stability was a precondition of his business model, not a product of it. He could condition the financial options available to the governments that survived revolutions. He could not determine whether revolutions occurred. When the barricades went up in Paris, James watched from the same position as everyone else, as someone who had built an enormous amount inside a structure he had not built and could not control. The direction of causality, as Ferguson insists and the evidence supports, was not reliably from banker to sovereign. It ran the other way often enough to matter. James de Rothschild was the most powerful private financier in France for 4 decades. He was also dependent on France. That is not a contradiction. It is the precise description of what private financial power was and was not in the 19th century. And it is an answer that satisfies nobody completely, which is usually a sign that it is correct. While James was performing power in Paris, hunting weekends at Ferrières, dinner with emperors, a railway connecting Paris to the Channel, his brother Salomon was running the Vienna operation from a hotel room. Not temporarily, not while waiting for a lease to clear, permanently. Salomon Mayer Rothschild was, by the 1820s and 1830s, one of the most consequential private bankers in Austria. He managed loans to the Habsburg state. He worked in close coordination with Metternich, the architect of post-Napoleonic European conservatism, the man who more than any other single figure organized the political order of the continent after 1815. He financed the early Austrian railways, the capital he moved, the credit relationships he maintained, the sovereign debt he structured. These were not peripheral to the Habsburg economy. They were load-bearing, and he could not legally own property in Vienna. Austrian law at the time prohibited Jewish ownership of real estate in the city, not as an informal custom, as a formal legal prohibition. The man sitting across the table from Metternich, arranging the financial instruments through which the Habsburg state funded its ambitions, could not, under the laws of the state whose government he was advising, sign a lease on an apartment. His solution, for years, was the Hotel zum Römischen Kaiser. Salomon lived there, permanently. He ran the Austrian branch of the most powerful private banking house in the world, from a suite in a hotel, not because he preferred hotel living, not because he was between arrangements, but because the alternative was illegal. The Hotel zum Römischen Kaiser was a perfectly respectable address. That is not the point. The point is that Metternich could call on him at that address, and Metternich did, and the meeting could concern the financial architecture of an empire, and afterwards Salomon would return to a room he did not own, in a building he could not purchase in a city whose laws did not recognize his right to occupy it as a permanent resident with full standing. That is not an irony. It is a structural fact about 19th century Europe that the Rothschild story makes visible with unusual clarity. The concession Salomon eventually extracted the right to lease property came through years of negotiation, conducted not from a position of legal argument, but from the position of financial indispensability. The Habsburg state understood, at the level of practical calculation, if not at the level of official policy, that alienating Salomon Mayer Rothschild carried costs. Not moral costs, financial costs. Bond issuances that might not go smoothly, credit facilities that might tighten. The leverage was implicit, never stated directly in the correspondence that survives, but the correspondence does not need to state it directly. The sequence of events states it plainly enough. Years of requests, then a concession, then a workaround. What Salomon received was not equality. It was tolerance, specifically the tolerance extended to someone too valuable to antagonize, which is a different category entirely from the rights extended to a citizen. A citizen has standing under the law. Salomon had leverage over the men who administered the law. These are not the same thing, and the distinction mattered enormously in practice. If Salomon's financial importance had diminished, the workaround would have evaporated with it. The legal prohibition would have remained. Rights rooted in leverage are not rights at all. They are temporary exemptions, revocable at the discretion of whoever holds the actual power. This is the film's central paradox in its most compressed form. Everything the Rothschilds had built, the courier network, the five-city architecture, the sovereign debt operations, the ability to move capital across borders faster than any government produced this. A man who could conditionally shape the financial decisions of empires could not unconditionally rent the room where he slept. The Rothschilds understood this, which is why they fought, actively and consistently, for Jewish legal emancipation across Europe. Moses Montefiore, Nathan's brother-in-law, connected the Rothschild financial network directly to organized advocacy for Jewish civil rights in Britain and beyond. The family's resources and relationships were applied to the emancipation cause in ways that went beyond philanthropy into political coordination. This is documented. What the historical record does not settle is the question of motive. Was emancipation advocacy an expression of principled belief, a commitment to legal equality that the family maintained regardless of its effect on their own position? Or was it, at least partly, strategic? The Rothschilds' position would obviously be more secure, less contingent on the goodwill of individual officials, less subject to revocation if Jews in Europe held full legal standing. Salomon would not need a workaround for a lease if the law simply did not prohibit the lease. The interests of principle and self-interest pointed in exactly the same direction. When that happens, the historical record alone cannot tell you which one was doing the driving. The film presents this as open because it is open. But there is a deeper question the scholarly literature has not fully answered, and it deserves naming. Jewish identity did not merely explain where the Rothschilds started, it shaped how the network operated. Consider what the cross-border architecture actually required. Trust, enforced without any legal framework that applied across sovereign jurisdictions simultaneously, transmitted through family bonds and community ties, in an environment where no external court would reliably uphold a contract between a Jewish banker in Vienna and a Jewish banker in London against the interests of a Christian. Sovereign. The network's internal cohesion, the system of family couriers, the coded correspondence, the cousin marriages designed to keep capital and loyalty aligned, these were not merely clever business practices. They were adaptations to an environment in which the legal infrastructure available to other commercial actors was systematically unavailable. The exclusion was not just the origin story, it was the ongoing engineering logic embedded in how the network held together. The Rothschilds had built workarounds for the absence of legal protection into the network's fundamental structure, and those workarounds turned out to be more efficient than the formal institutions they substituted for. That is not a comfortable observation. It does not resolve into a clean lesson about the virtues of adversity. It is simply what the evidence shows. Salomon eventually obtained his lease. He moved out of the Hotel zum Römischen Kaiser. The legal prohibition on Jewish property ownership in Vienna did not change because Salomon moved. It remained in place for other Jews who did not have the implicit leverage of being Austria's most important private banker. The workaround was personal, not structural. Salomon got a room, the law stayed. Before the Rothschilds built what they built, sovereign lending was a gamble on the survival of the borrower. Monarchs borrowed from individual creditors, often under duress, and defaulted when it suited them. Edward III of England defaulted on Florentine banking houses in the 14th century and destroyed them. Philip II of Spain declared bankruptcy 4 separate times, between 1557 and 1596, each time wiping out creditors who had no recourse and no mechanism for distributing the loss. Wars did not merely create debt, they erased it, along with the governments that owed it. A loan to a king was a bet on whether that king would still be king when the note came due. More often than not, it was a bet you lost. This was the baseline. Not an imperfect version of modern sovereign finance, something categorically different from it. What changed was not that governments became more trustworthy. What changed was the mechanism through which government debt was structured, distributed, and enforced. Here is the mechanism the Rothschilds built. A government Prussia in 18 France in 1823. Austria, through the 1820s, issues bonds. Formal instruments promising to repay a fixed sum at a fixed date, with interest paid from tax revenue in the interim. The Rothschild house underwrites those bonds, meaning it prices them, commits to purchase any that go unsold, and takes responsibility for the issuance. Then it distributes them, not to a single creditor, not to a small circle of court financiers, to investors across multiple sovereign jurisdictions simultaneously through Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, reaching a pool of capital no single city bank could access. The government gets money now, the investors get a reliable annual return. The banker earns a fee on the transaction and earns something more durable than a fee, the relationship that makes the next issuance possible. The 1818 Prussian loan, £5 million, was not a one-off transaction. It was a proof of concept. Prussia needed capital. The Rothschilds could deliver it across 5 markets at once, at terms a single country banking house could not match. The same logic applied when James arranged approximately 270 million francs in loans to the French Restoration government in 1823. When Salomon structured financing for the Habsburg state through the 1820s, when Karl handled the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, each transaction was the same mechanism operating in a new jurisdiction. Prove it works once, repeat it. Prove it works 5 times, and you have an infrastructure. In 1846, James took the same logic and applied it to iron rails. The Chemin de Fer du Nord connecting Paris to the Channel ports was not merely a railway, it was the sovereign bond mechanism converted into physical geography, capital raised across multiple investor markets, deployed into infrastructure, generating returns across decades. The bond was the abstract version. The railway was what happened when you repeated the process long enough and at sufficient scale to reshape a country's physical landscape. The downstream consequence of repeating that process across 5 decades and a dozen sovereign clients was a fundamental shift in how states finance themselves. Governments learned they could borrow against future tax revenue at predictable rates through a reliable institutional infrastructure without requiring an individual patron wealthy enough to cover the whole loan. This made possible something that would have seemed implausible to Philip II's treasury officials: funding a standing army, a national railway network, a public health system, without requiring the immediate taxation to pay for it in full. Defer the cost into the future, spread the obligation across thousands of bondholders, and keep governing in the present. That model is now so universal it has become genuinely invisible. Every sovereign debt issuance, every treasury bond, every government that borrows at a yield set by market demand, rather than a private negotiation with a single creditor, operates inside an architecture. The Rothschilds did not invent a loan, but did more than almost any other institution to standardize, demonstrate, and replicate across sovereign jurisdictions. The internationalization of capital was the mechanism's enabling condition and its most consequential side effect simultaneously. In the early 19th century, capital was largely national, the assumption being that wealth generated in France stayed in France, that English investors financed English enterprises, that money respected the same borders as armies. The Rothschild network challenged this not as a philosophical proposition, but as a daily operating practice. A Prussian bond sold in London required English investors to accept a claim on Prussian tax revenue as a legitimate asset. An Austrian bond distributed through Frankfurt required investors in one German state to hold paper backed by the creditworthiness of a rival power. This was not self-evident. It required the Rothschilds to serve as the credible intermediary the institution trusted across jurisdictions simultaneously, precisely because its family structure made it answerable in all of them at once. The practice had consequences nobody planned for. International capital flows became the engine of 19th century industrialization across Europe and eventually across the world. They also became the engine of colonial extraction. The same mechanisms that financed French railways financed infrastructure in territories where the returns flowed back to European investors and the costs were borne by populations, who held no bonds and attended no shareholder meetings. The tension between democratic sovereignty and international capital, whether a government elected by its citizens can actually control its economy, when that economy depends on the confidence of bondholders in Frankfurt and London, is not a tension the Rothschilds invented, but they were among the first to demonstrate it at continental scale. That tension runs directly from the 1820s through the gold standard debates of the 1890s, through Bretton Woods in 1944, through the Latin American debt crises of the 1980s, through what happened to Greece between 2010 and 2015. The architecture generates the tension as a structural feature, not a malfunction. The architecture also generated its own obsolescence. By the 1860s, the electric telegraph had made near instantaneous communication between cities available to any institution that could afford the cable fees. The information advantage embedded in the Rothschild courier network, the private riders, the coded family correspondence moving faster than state dispatches evaporated, not gradually, structurally. The telegraph did not give competitors better couriers. It made couriers irrelevant. Simultaneously, joint stock banks were demonstrating that private family houses had a fundamental scale ceiling. A family, however large and however disciplined, can deploy only the capital it controls. A joint stock bank raises capital from thousands of shareholders, aggregates it, and deploys it at volumes a private partnership cannot match. By the 1870s, institutions built on this model were operating at scales that compressed the Rothschilds' relative position in European finance, even as the family's absolute wealth remained substantial. The dominance over European sovereign debt that had been near total between approximately 1,820 and 1,860 declined steadily across the following decades as these forces accumulated. Whether this constitutes decline or transformation is genuinely unclear. The firm that Nathan built on St. Swithin's Lane did not close. It adapted. It moved from primary bond issuance toward advisory work, toward the quieter functions of a financial institution that no longer needs to prove it can move sovereign capital across 5 cities in 48 hours. The architecture it helped build was running without it. That is one definition of success. It is also, depending on how you hold it, a description of having been absorbed. By the middle of the 19th century, the Rothschilds had become something the Rothschilds were not. Not a banking dynasty. Not 5 brothers operating across 5 cities under a corporate charter written by their father. A symbol, a shorthand. A figure in the European imagination so far removed from the actual family that the actual family had become almost irrelevant to it. The caricatures were everywhere. Newspapers across France, Germany, Britain and Austria printed images of hook-nosed financiers pulling the strings of kings, rigging wars for profit, running governments from behind a curtain of gold. The puppet master image appeared in hundreds of variations across dozens of publications over several decades. The underlying claim was consistent: a secret Jewish power operating above and beyond the governments of Europe, bending sovereign decisions to private financial will. Here is what makes this more than ordinary propaganda. The images drew on things that were real. The influence was real. The network was real. The government relationships were real. The Rothschilds had structured sovereign debt for Prussia, Austria, France, and Naples. They had transmitted British subsidies across a war-torn continent. Nathan Rothschild's threat to withdraw credit was an instrument governments took seriously. None of that is disputed. What the mythology did was take these documented facts and transform them qualitatively from a private banking house that had made itself structurally indispensable to an omnipotent, malevolent Jewish conspiracy operating outside and above the political order. The distance between those two descriptions is enormous. But the mythology was not built from nothing. It was built from distortion. And a myth built on a distortion of real things is categorically harder to kill than one built on pure fabrication. The myths also drew on something deeper than any single family's history. Centuries of European legal exclusion had concentrated Jewish commercial activity in finance and trade precisely because other professions were closed. The Rothschilds did not create European anti-Semitism. They became its most visible target at the moment when popular anxiety about financial power over political life was reaching new intensity. The industrial economy was generating wealth on scales that dwarfed anything in living memory, and that wealth appeared to move according to logics no democratic institution controlled. The Rothschilds were the most legible face of that anxiety. The mythology attached itself to them because they were there, and because they were Jewish, and because European culture had centuries of practice imagining Jewish finance as predatory. The Waterloo myth crystallized in print in 1846. Nathan Rothschild had been dead for a decade. The pamphlet published in French propagandistic form, sometimes identified with a text circulating under the title Napoléon et la trahison des banquiers, took the documented fact of Nathan's advance intelligence and rebuilt it as theatre. The deliberate sell, the manufactured panic, the secret repurchase at the bottom, millions made in a single day of calculated deception. The story travelled because the underlying truth it distorted was genuine. Nathan had received news of Wellington's victory before the British government. That part was accurate. Everything built on top of it was embellishment. But the embellishment rode the truth across Europe like a passenger. By the time it reached audiences in countries where French pamphlets were not directly read, it had already been absorbed into the broader mythology as established fact. This is the mechanism. You cannot debunk a myth that is 90% accurate by correcting the 10% that is false. The accurate core keeps pulling the false conclusion back into circulation. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion appeared in Russia in 1903. It was a fabrication, a plagiarized text constructed to look like a Jewish master plan for world domination. It drew explicitly on the Rothschild mythology that had been accumulating in European print culture for 60 years. Its influence, across the early 20th century, was direct and documented. Henry Ford serialized it in the United States beginning in 1920. Hitler cited it. The chain connecting 19th century caricatures of Rothschild puppet masters to the Protocols, and from the Protocols to the genocidal anti-Semitism of the 20th century, is not a matter of historical interpretation. It is a matter of traceable evidence. The connection exists in the texts, in the citations, in the stated beliefs of the people who organized mass murder. That is not hyperbole. That is the documentary record. In 1940, the Nazi government produced a film called Die Rothschilds. It was state-sponsored cinema, not fringe propaganda. It took the Waterloo manipulation legend Nathan at his pillar, the theatrical sell, the manufactured panic, and rendered it for mass audiences as authoritative historical drama. The film presented a Jewish banking family as the archetypal enemy. Predatory, disloyal, willing to profit from the destruction of nations. It was released the same year the Nazi regime was accelerating its program of theft, expulsion, and murder across occupied Europe. The film was not tangential to that program. It was preparation for it, an attempt to provide a historical narrative that made the program legible to German audiences as justice rather than crime. And then the ideology reached the address. Salomon Meyer Rothschild had built the Vienna branch into one of the most important private banking operations in Austria over 4 decades. He had structured Habsburg's sovereign debt, financed early Austrian railways, worked alongside Metternich at the centre of European conservative politics. He had done all of this while being legally prohibited from owning property in the city where he worked. His son and successors carried the operation forward. By the time the Nazi regime annexed Austria in March 1938, the Vienna branch was over a century old. What followed was systematic. Family members were forced to flee. Austrian assets were seized. Louis von Rothschild, the last head of the Vienna house, was arrested and held. His release was not a matter of law or diplomacy. It was a ransom transaction. The price was the surrender of the family's Austrian industrial holdings, ironworks, manufacturing operations, physical assets built across generations. Louis was released in 1939 and left Austria. The banking operations that Salomon had built from a hotel suite because no apartment was legally available to him were dismantled by the state that had always been their host. The ideology that organized this destruction had a specific intellectual genealogy. It ran from the caricatures of the 1840s through the Waterloo pamphlets, through the Protocols, through the 1940 film, to the men who came to the Vienna offices with the legal authority of a state behind them. The Rothschild name had been so thoroughly mythologized as the symbol of Jewish financial malevolence that destroying the actual Rothschilds could be presented as a historically necessary act. There is a question this film has to answer directly, and this is the moment to answer it. Every accurate account of Rothschild financial power contains elements that have been weaponized. The influence was real. The information advantage was real. The sovereign relationships were real. Telling the true story means telling a story that conspiracy theorists will mine for fragments, strip of context, and recirculate. This film chose aggressive transparency over protective omission. It made that choice because the mythology persists precisely where the real history has been inadequately told. The vacuum left by silence has been filled by stories with a body count. The honest version is more powerful than the mythology, but only when it is actually told. The address is still there. St. Swithin's Lane, in the City of London. Nathan Mayer Rothschild established his firm at that address around 1804. Rothschild & Co. operates there today, not as a museum, not as a heritage site, as a functioning institution active in investment banking, wealth management, and advisory work on mergers, acquisitions, and sovereign debt restructurings. The political landscape between then and now includes the Napoleonic Wars, the revolutions of 1848, 2 world wars, the systematic destruction of the Vienna branch, decolonization, the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, and the restructuring of the entire global financial order at least twice over. The firm on St. Swithin's Lane survived all of it without relocating. That is not a sentimental detail. It is evidence about the structural durability of what was built, and a direct rebuttal to any reading of this story as one of ultimate decline. What persists is not the Rothschild name alone. It is the mechanism they helped design. Every national government that issues treasury bonds is participating in a system the Rothschilds did not invent from scratch, but did more than almost any other single institution to develop, test, and scale across multiple sovereign jurisdictions simultaneously. Before their network reached operational maturity, sovereign lending was episodic and catastrophic for lenders when it went wrong. Monarchs defaulted. Wars erased debts along with the regimes that carried them. What the 5-city structure proved through the 1818 Prussian loan, the French Restoration financing, the Austrian railway operations, James's chemin de fer du Nord was that private institutions could reliably intermediate between governments that needed capital and investors who held it, on terms transparent enough to attract buyers and structured enough to survive political instability. That proof became a template. The template became a norm. The norm became invisible. Every pension fund holding government securities, every central bank managing sovereign debt, every finance ministry pricing a bond issue is operating inside an architecture that has a specific origin point and a specific address. The 19th century never resolved the question this raises. Neither has the 21st. What is the appropriate relationship between private financial power and the political life of nations? The Rothschilds did not seize territory. They did not hold elected or appointed office in the countries where they operated. Their power was the power of conditioning, not of commanding. When Nathan Rothschild's threat to withdraw credit was taken seriously by a sovereign government, that government was responding not to force, but to the recognition that its options had been narrowed by someone outside its legal authority. Democratic theory was built on the Westphalian assumption that political power is located in governments and exercised through law and legitimate coercion. The Rothschild operation demonstrated at continental scale that financial power could be exercised across sovereign boundaries in ways that neither political authority could reach nor democratic accountability could easily touch. No constitutional document had a clause for this. None does now. The opacity compounded it. The Rothschilds operated with a degree of privacy, unusual even by private banking standards. Correspondence was coded. Operations were rarely publicized. Political influence moved through private channels, private dinners, private letters delivered by private couriers. Some of this was the rational calculation of a Jewish family in an environment where visibility had historically invited persecution. Salomon Mayer could not legally own property in Vienna. Louis von Rothschild had been held for ransom less than a century ago. The incentive structure for opacity was not irrational. But the consequence was that wherever financial power operates without public accountability, the public imagination tends to fill the gap. And the stories it fills the gap with are not usually charitable. The modern disclosure requirements attached to financial institutions, mandatory reporting, regulatory oversight, Public accounting standards are not bureaucratic inventions. They are, in part, a response to what happens when private financial power operates without accountability for long enough that the explanations circulating to describe it become more dangerous than the power itself. Mayor Amschel Rothschild's story does not belong to the Rothschilds alone. The pattern it represents is broader and more durable than any single family. Systemic exclusion does not prevent accumulation of power. It shapes the form that power takes. When formal institutions close their doors to particular groups, when land ownership is forbidden, when most professions are legally blocked, when movement requires paying a body tax at every border, the excluded do not simply disappear from economic life. They develop alternative mechanisms. They operate through the one corridor left open, and under certain conditions, those alternative mechanisms generate something the excluding institutions cannot easily replicate: cross-border trust networks, information systems built on family rather than legal obligation, methods for moving capital across jurisdictions in ways that state-based actors cannot. The Judengasse produced the Rothschild network not despite being a cage, but because it was one. That structural logic did not die with the ghetto. It operates wherever formal institutions create systematic exclusions and then discover, too late, that the excluded have built something the institutions need. The gates at each end of the Judengasse were locked every night, locked on Sundays, locked on every Christian holiday. From inside those gates, a man with almost no legal standing and no inheritable profession built a system. That system transferred £1.2 million in gold across a continent at war. It funded the British campaign against Napoleon, conditioned the sovereign options of Prussia, Austria, France and Naples across 4 decades, and paid for the railway that connected Paris to the Channel. His sons ran it from London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt and Naples simultaneously. His grandsons watched the telegraph make the courier network obsolete, and the joint stock banks make the private family partnership look small. The firm adapted. The architecture remained. It is still there, not as legacy, not as memory, but as the operating assumption underneath every government budget that has ever been funded by borrowing. Sovereign debt markets, international capital flows, the normalized expectation that states can raise money against future tax revenue and that private institutions will price and distribute the paper. None of this was given. None of it was inevitable. It was constructed, transaction by transaction, from a starting position of legal humiliation and locked gates. The men who built it could not legally own the ground they stood on when they started. That is the ending.